Yesterday, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation announced that they are taking Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, to court over concerns about transparency. The CTF requested records detailing how much the CBC has spent on advertising over the past 5 years, but the broadcaster has refused to release the information despite receiving $1.4 billion from taxpayers last year. The CTF has now filed a legal challenge in federal court to force the disclosure of these records. We were joined by CTF's General Counsel, Devin. Devin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, can you walk us through what specifically the CTF was looking for from the CBC and how we got to the point where we're at where you feel that you need to sue?
Absolutely. So, here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we fundamentally think the taxpayers have a right to know how their money is being spent. And this isn't just about the single instance of advertising. Our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe, files dozens of access to information requests trying to figure out how the CBC is spending our money. Some of them are what we think is simple questions. In this case, what is the dollar sign and how much they're spending on advertising? And they're refusing to tell us. As such, we have no other choice now but to file an action with federal court, which we did earlier this week, asking them to disclose these records. Fundamentally, we think, given the fact, as mentioned, the CBC receives $1.4 billion from taxpayers last year, and it's looking like the Trudeau government wants to increase the funding to the CBC this year. We think fundamentally that financial records of any kind, whether it's advertising, which is the source of contention in this lawsuit, or some of the other issues that we've been encountering, for example, requesting how much they're spending on executive bonuses. We think this is all information that should be in the public domain. And if they're not willing to release this information, we're going to have no other choice but to take them to federal court and get those answers that taxpayers deserve.
Now, supporters of the CBC might argue that being forced to disclose those details may be exposing sensitive aspects of their business model. What do you make of that objection?
So I would understand if we were searching for, how much they bid on this specific ad spot, and thus, a competitor may be able to see, oh, if they're bidding X dollars, we can go in with X minus one and get this contract. We're not looking for that level of granularity here. Our request is just about the dollar figure. How much money did the CBC spend on advertising in 1 year? I don't think you'd have to be a business genius to look at those numbers and somehow get some competitive position or competitive advantage. Fundamentally, this is a very clear example of the CBC not being transparent with the people that they're accountable to, which are the taxpayers that fund them.
And can you explain to us what happens next in terms of the CBC's potential response and when this might actually end up in court?
Yeah, so we're urgently hoping that this matter gets heard as soon as possible, and we're going to make that request into the court. Of course, as you're no doubt aware, the courts are at a backlog right now, and we deal with this a lot in some of the ongoing lawsuits we have filed. However, we think this is an important issue to get dealt with as soon as possible. As you're no doubt aware, the future of the CBC is up for discussion in this federal election. You have the conservative leader Pierre Poilievre announcing he wants to defund the CBC. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the Liberal government right now in Ottawa that wants to increase funding to the CBC. So it's certainly a hot topic issue going into the election. And we think all Canadians should have the right to access this information before the election so that, one, their freedom of information or freedom of expression rights are not violated and they're able to scrutinize the government accordingly. And I think if you're the CBC, if you're a big proponent of the CBC, you should still see value in having this information disclosed, because having this out in the open will make the marketplace of ideas better and allow for better discussions about what involvement the CBC should have in Canadian society, whether it's Mr. Poilievre's view, a view we share that the CBC should be defunded, or a view shared by Justin Trudeau's Liberal government right now that funding should, as early as a few days ago, announced they wanted to double the funding or nearly double to 2.5 billion. So it's currently an important issue, and I think it's something that courts should be wanting to hear sooner rather than later, so this information can be out in time for the next federal election.
Now, you did just mention that there's a court backlog. So, given that the court proceedings may take some time, critics of your organization might argue that the CTF is wasting taxpayers' money here because the CBC is going to have to pay lawyers to defend the organization in court. What would your response be to those critics?
I think that's, I mean, that may be true that the CBC will have to lawyer up now and fight back against this lawsuit. If they want to avoid wasting tax dollars on a legal challenge, they could disclose the information that from the outset. Again, we think that fundamentally Canadians have a right to access financial information when it involves the spending of tax dollars. And in this case, if the CBC doesn't want to incur the cost to fight against challenges like this, they can be transparent at the outset and can avoid all of these issues. And I'll be honest with you, this isn't the only lawsuit that we may bring against the CBC if they don't start to become transparent on the millions of or which executives are receiving millions of dollars in bonuses. We're going to be challenging them on that too, and we have a number of complaints in with the office of the information commissioner right now. So I think if the CBC is concerned, or proponents of the CBC are concerned about the money being spent on these lawsuits, they could avoid the issue altogether and start being transparent about these funds.
Well, there have been lots of debates about what direction the CBC should go in. One of the larger debates has been the CBC's funding level, with some liberals suggesting that the CBC should actually get more public funding. Do you think they should?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think if you look at the ratings for the CBC, they're pretty abysmal right now. It's very clear that Canadians are moving further and further away from the CBC and to alternative news sources, including the one I'm on right now. And I think there's less value in the CBC, in which Canadians have access to a lot of really great journalists on their smartphones and on other TV stations. So would be very disappointed to see any increase in funding to the CBC, especially when it is hard for any journalist to be independent, despite what they may say, when they know at the end of the day their checks are being signed by a politician. So we want to see more independent media and less tax dollars being used to bribe journalists.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.